Nothing about the guilty plea or the charge implicates anyone other than Mr. Flynn. Good evening. Those are the words of White House lawyer Ty Cobb. Tonight, to the contrary, the many implications for current and former senior transition and administration officials of former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn's guilty plea in the Russia investigation. The many ways it suggests there may be far more to come, because he also agreed to cooperate with special counsel Robert Mueller. The many ways it undermines virtually everything the president and his surrogates have been saying about Russia for month after month after month. The many ways it fills in pieces of a fact picture and a potentially very bleak picture for the White House, people close to the president, notably son-in-law Jared Kushner, and perhaps even for the president himself. Now, whatever comes to pass, what happened today, Flynn's admission that he'd lied to the FBI about contact with Russia's ambassador to the United States, and what's contained in the related court filing, it really moves the needle. It gives context to everything that we've learned so far. And keeping them honest tonight, it stands in sharp contrast to much of what the administration has been saying about Russia again and again and again.
The Russia story is a total fabrication. It's just an excuse for the greatest loss in the history of American politics.
Russia is a ruse.
There is no collusion. You know why? Because I don't speak to Russians. This Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story.
The entire thing has been a witch hunt.
Look, there has been no obstruction. There has been no collusion.
All I can tell you is this. There was no collusion. There was no nothing.
Russia has 20% of our uranium. I think that's your Russia story. That's your real Russia story, not a story where they talk about collusion and there was none.
Well, that has been the line, even as one revelation after another undermines it. First, with respect to contact during the campaign, some of which the guilty plea of George Papadopoulos revealed. He was derided as a mere coffee boy by people in the White House. However, former Lieutenant General, former Defense Intelligence Agency Director, former National Security Advisor to the President of the United States is no mere coffee boy. He was central to the campaign and central to the transition. Now, simply put, part of the very tight inner circle, a big fish, and now for Robert Mueller, a big catch. A big piece in this puzzle as well. With the information contained in Michael Flynn's plea, a window opens into contact with Russia during the transition, possibly illegal attempts to conduct foreign policy, and then lying about it during his brief tenure as National Security Advisor. Today's news also sheds new light on something fired Acting Attorney General Sally Yates said to me about the trip she made to the White House on the 26th of January to warn that General Flynn had lied about at least one Russian contact, was known to have lied, and was therefore potentially vulnerable to blackmail by the Russians.
When were you first made aware that General Flynn was lying about his interactions with the Russian ambassador?
Well, first let me say, and I know that this may seem kind of artificial to folks, I can't really talk about what General Flynn's underlying conduct was because that's based on classified information.
Can you say when you were made aware about an issue with his underlying conduct?
It was in the early part of January where we first got some indication about what he had been involved in, and then sort of the middle part of January when there were false statements that started coming out of the White House based on misrepresentations he had made to people there.
Well, she was fired 5 days after first warning the White House, and Flynn was allowed to stay on another 2 weeks, even though, as you just heard, the White House knew Flynn was lying about Russia contacts. Getting back to the underlying conduct, which Sally Yates declined to tell us about, it is now revealed in Robert Mueller's charging document today. It centers on late December. And before we dig deeper on that with our correspondents and our legal panel over the next hour, a reminder just of the context. This is happening weeks after the U.S. intelligence community warned that Russia had meddled in the election, and at the very same time that President Obama is sanctioning Russia for that meddling. Also, obviously, after the Trump Tower meeting, the Russia contacts by Carter Page and, now we know, George Papadopoulos. Additionally, it came after the contacts with the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, during the Republican convention, after the early December meeting with Kislyak at Trump Tower, the one involving Flynn and Jared Kushner, at which Kushner asked about setting up a private communications channel between the transition team and the Kremlin. Now, in other words, what is described in the documents today transpired after many related developments and prior to many others, including the president allegedly asking James Comey to go easy on Flynn, his firing then of James Comey, his reported leaning on Republican lawmakers to end their own investigation, and of course the naming of Robert Mueller. So according to the charging document, on or about the 28th of December, as President Obama announces sanctions, Kislyak contacts Flynn. On or about the next day, Flynn contacts a senior transition official at Mar-a-Lago. We now know who she is. We'll have more on that shortly. Then he calls Kislyak and, according to the charging document, later lies about it to the FBI. The Russians, you'll recall, do not retaliate for the sanctions, which raised a lot of questions at the time. The 30th, President-elect Trump tweets, "Great move on delay by V. Putin. I always knew he was very smart." Kellyanne Conway was at Mar-a-Lago when all this was going on, and her line, nothing was going on.
We've been talking about this for a while. I think that, all we heard all through the election was Russia, Russia, Russia. Whenever it came to anything Donald Trump said or did, it seemed most days. And now, since the election, it's just this fever pitch of accusations and insinuations. And we know why Hillary Clinton lost. I think the cues and clues are pretty obvious. They were obvious to us all along. They're very obvious to everyone now. And I don't believe Vladimir Putin deterred her from competing in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, states that Donald Trump carried for the first time as a Republican in decades.
So again, she said that on or around the very day we now know Flynn was talking to Russians and reporting back to Mar-a-Lago, where Kellyanne Conway did that interview. And just a couple weeks later on Face the Nation, here's what Vice President-elect Mike Pence said about Flynn's conversations with Kislyak.
It was strictly coincidental that they had a conversation. They did not discuss anything having to do with the United States' decision to expel diplomats or impose a censure against Russia.
Well, today's charging documents suggest clearly otherwise about that and about more. And even as the repercussions of this are just beginning, we're already learning more about the events described in them and the circumstances surrounding them. So with that, for the very latest, I want to go now to CNN Justice correspondent Pamela Brown. So Pamela, just walk us through exactly what happened today in court, specifically what Flynn admitted to lying about.
Well, Anderson, Flynn's charge of lying to the FBI in the plea agreement center around conversations he had with then Russian ambassador to the U.S., Sergei Kislyak, in December last year. In the court documents filed today, we learned that on December 29th, Flynn called his subordinate, former Deputy National Security Advisor K.T. McFarland, and other transition officials at Mar-a-Lago, where they discussed the new sanctions being imposed on Russia. Other transition officials at Mar-a-Lago that weekend include Reince Priebus, Steve Bannon, Stephen Miller, and Kellyanne Conway. And according to Flynn, the transition officials did not want Russia to escalate the situation. So Flynn immediately called Kislyak, asking Russia not to overreact to sanctions that the U.S. government imposed on Russia that day. The court documents say Flynn called McFarland back and briefed her on the call with Kislyak about the sanctions. That is noteworthy because Vice President Pence, as you'll recall, stated on national television in January, the next month, sanctions were not discussed with Kislyak. But now we're learning, at the very least, Anderson, administration officials beyond Flynn knew that and knew that was a lie, what Pence said on national television. Also today, another interaction Flynn had with the Russian ambassador was revealed, according to court documents. On December 22nd, a senior Trump transition official who we now know as Jared Kushner asked Flynn to find out how foreign governments, including Russia, viewed an upcoming UN security resolution about settlements in Israel, and to, quote, learn where each government stood on the resolution and to influence those governments to delay the vote or defeat the resolution. And so, Anderson, today the government said Flynn lied about those conversations with Kislyak in his FBI interviews.
So how did Mueller and his team of investigators get Flynn to cooperate?
Well, Flynn entered into a plea agreement, so he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of lying to the FBI in exchange for providing information to prosecutors that the prosecutors clearly view as helpful in their investigation. Flynn has also, as we know, been concerned about possible legal exposure for his son over ties to Turkey. So this plea deal could have also been a way for Flynn to protect his family, protect his son. In a statement released today, he acknowledged wrongdoing, and he said, my guilty plea and agreement to cooperate with the special counsel's office reflect a decision I made in the best interest of my family and of our country. Anderson.
What could Flynn be facing if convicted?
Well, he could face 5 years in prison, but today the judge said he could impose a harsher or lighter sentence. However, since Flynn is cooperating, this is a plea deal, a harsher charge or sentence, I should say, would be unlikely. And what happened today raises the question of what's next. Now that Flynn's cooperating, we know the investigation continues, particularly in the obstruction of justice probe. Interviews are still happening, and it's worth noting, Anderson, I believe we reported on your show, Mueller's team interviewed senior White House advisor Jared Kushner earlier this month. And it now appears they wanted to get his version of events before today's plea agreement, knowing what they already have from Flynn and other witnesses. And clearly the version in these court documents today is what Mueller's team thinks is true, but it doesn't line up with what people close to the White House are telling us. They are saying Kushner didn't direct Flynn in that December 22nd phone call. Anderson.
All right. Pam Brown, appreciate that. Thanks very much. I want to bring in our legal team, CNN Chief Legal Analyst Jeffrey Toobin, former Special Counsel, and Robert Mueller's former Special Assistant at the Justice Department, Michael Zeldin, Carrie Cordero, also formerly of the Department of Justice. She currently teaches law at Georgetown, and former Virginia Attorney General Ken Cuccinelli. So, Jeff, I mean, hard to overstate the significance of all of this today and the fact that Flynn is now cooperating with Special Counsel Mueller. I'm wondering, just broad strokes, what stands out to you in these filings?
Let me just... It's hard. There have been so many discrete facts. Let me just try to point to one of them. You know, when James Comey was fired, he testified afterwards about his contacts with the President Trump. You know, his constant requests to limit the investigation, you know, show your loyalty. But on February 14th, it was the most extraordinary contact between Trump and Comey. There was a meeting in the Oval Office, and Trump shooed away the Vice President, the Attorney General, and it was just man-to-man with Comey. And what does Donald Trump say? He says, "I want you to go easy on Michael Flynn. Flynn's a good guy. Leave Flynn alone." Today we learn maybe why he was doing that, because Flynn knows a lot about the misconduct that was going on in the White House. And the fact that he was trying to cover up for Flynn is really, I think, an incredibly damaging piece of evidence about the president's culpability in all that's gone on here. So I think the juxtaposition of today's guilty plea and the encounter with Comey on February 14th is a really damning portrait.
So you're saying, you know, the idea that it was Kushner directing Michael Flynn. Are you saying it's possible the president was directing Kushner to direct Michael?
Well, you know, again, I don't want to get ahead of where the evidence is. You know, Jared Kushner, why Jared Kushner is involved in telling anyone what to do is kind of a mystery, given his complete ignorance and absence of experience and knowledge of any of the things he was dealing with and continues to deal with in the White House. So I don't believe that Jared Kushner just woke up one morning and decided to tell Michael Flynn what to do with the Russian ambassador. But I do think that the issue of why the Trump administration, the Trump transition team, over and over again was trying to cultivate Russia, was trying to ease the sanctions, was trying to make nice with Vladimir Putin, very smart, according to the December 30th tweet by the president. That question is still at the heart of this case. Why was the Trump administration and the Trump campaign so solicitous of Vladimir Putin?
Michael, I mean, legally speaking, what could this ultimately mean for the president?
Well, it depends on what the president knew and when he knew it and what he did with that knowledge. The thing that's interesting to me about the information that was the core of Flynn's guilty plea today is that the lies that Mueller chose were lies that related to sanctions and lies that related to the UN Security Council in language that tracks exactly the Logan Act. So I think that, which makes it illegal for an individual private citizen to interfere in government affairs, which is exactly what is alleged here and which is what alleged Kushner did. So these lies point directly to where Mueller is going as he investigates his core mandate of links and coordination between the Trump campaign and Russia. And the people that are implicated by the lies in this indictment or information and what Mueller has to investigate are Sessions and Kushner and Manafort still for additional lies for Flynn Jr. and for Don Jr. So there are a whole host of people who the lies of this information implicate in possible criminal wrongdoing. So for all of these people, they have to be wondering, one, if they were interviewed by the FBI, what did they say? And two, will they be viewed as this guy was viewed, Flynn? Because remember, Flynn is pleading guilty to a lie based on "I don't recall" as his answer. Not just an affirmative lie, I didn't do it, but also I didn't recall. Anyone who's watched Jeff Sessions testify has heard him say that 100 times. Also in this information, they refer to Flynn.
Mueller, that tells you that Mueller's willing to bring charges based on an "I don't know" as opposed to an outright lie.
Exactly. And also what's interesting to me is that in this information, they specifically called Flynn a surrogate. And so anyone who said that they were unaware of surrogates interfacing with Russia now, in Mueller's view, would not be telling the truth, because this guy, Flynn, was called a surrogate by Mueller. And so if Sessions knew of these meetings, if any of those 5 people that you put up on the screen that were at Mar-a-Lago knew of this and said no surrogates had dealings with the Russians, that, in Mueller's view, is untrue. So there's a lot of sort of traps in this information for people as Mueller goes forward. But it's clear that he sees this as a big part of his mandate of links and coordination.
Kerry, let me ask you, Mueller would not have made this deal with Flynn and allowed Flynn to plead to what he pled if Mueller didn't already know, and correct me if I'm wrong, if Mueller didn't already know what Flynn had to offer about other people up the food chain, correct?
No, that's exactly right. That's how this process works in terms of the information that Flynn would have had to already have provided to the special counsel's office so that they have a roadmap for what information he has available to him. It's so important to note that Michael Flynn was charged with 1 count of making false statements. And yet in the information itself, the document that lays out the basis for that claim, there were several instances just in the 4 corners of that document indicating that he did not tell the truth to federal investigators on several points. And that in itself is just a small snapshot of the information that he would have already provided to investigators and the information that he knows and that they think he can provide in the future. So they charged him with a 1-count matter, very small, discrete charge that is only a tiny portion of the potential information that he can provide.
Anderson, may I add one point to that?
Sure.
And I agree with that completely, because also in the statement of offense, there is a paragraph that says, and Flynn lied about his Foreign Agent Registration Act dealings. That was not part of the information, but it was part of the statement of offense. So they say he has lied about that. And that is that which implicates his son, because that's the Flynn Intel Group. So they have already set out another lie in the statement of information, but it's an uncharged lie. So we'll have to see whether or not that's the lie that Michael Flynn Jr. gets charged with as they move forward there.
Ken, what stands out to you?
Well, for one, and it just jumped out as the foreign registration, is that scares the bejeebers out of an awful lot of K Street, because that law has not been probably abided by and enforced very much. And now a lot of people are looking at the potential to amend those filings. Paul Manafort, of course, started that for us, but this continues that concern. It's a kind of an unreported side story, not dealing with the central players here, but that a lot of people are looking at in Washington, I'm sure. With respect to today's action in court, look, Michael Flynn, especially in the transition, was in the middle of things in media res, as they would say in my high school, and presuming that he is continuing to be cooperative when there's every reason to think that, here's a guy who knows the conversations going back and forth, but the overarching political question, which really is the bigger one in this whole situation, and that is the potential for collusion with Russia. This is all after, of course, the campaign. And if Michael Flynn knows everything there is to know and tells everything there is to tell, if the campaign still wasn't coordinating or colluding with the Russians, and there's no yet evidence that they were, then the political side of this is eventually going to fizzle away. That doesn't mean Michael Flynn isn't going to have a felony and Paul Manafort and so forth aren't going to have a trail of felonies for lying to the FBI. But so far, with respect to anything other than Manafort's distant financial problems and failure to file, that's what we have.
Michael,
Ken, I think Ken
Jeff, just briefly go ahead.
Ken is ignoring the already significant evidence of collusion. Donald Trump Jr.'s emails to set up the meeting with the Russian lawyer in June. Repeated contacts with WikiLeaks about disclosing stolen emails. That is collusion. Now, I don't know if it's a discrete crime, but to say that there's no evidence of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia is simply just not true.
I got to get a quick break in. We're going to continue the discussion. I'll also get a reaction from the White House and the attempt to deflect attention onto the Obama administration, of all places. Later, senators get ready to vote on a tax bill as it is still being written right now.